It was midnight and I was on my way to pick up a fare. I worked for a small independent taxi company that operated the old-fashioned way. The customers phoned the office to order a cab and the dispatcher called me over the radio to give me the details that I needed for the journey. The pickup address for this customer was on the outskirts of the city, and that suited me just fine. The August heat was making the city's center a pressure cooker, and as the buildings thinned out, I started to relax and enjoy the drive. I rolled my window down. There was no breeze, so the open window didn't ease the heat in the cab, but it was good to feel the night air on my skin. The houses that I was passing now were older and many stood in their own grounds. From the cracks in their walls and the leaves in their gutters, a good few looked like they had seen better days. I took a right onto a tree-lined avenue. The house that I was looking for was on the left. I slowed and pulled up in front of a high, ornate metal gate. Beyond the gate, a house that looked like it had been plucked from the pages of a Gothic novel waited. Arched windows stood tall in a stone facade that was decorated with gargoyles. There were no lights visible, no signs of life, and I wondered for a moment if the dispatcher had made a rare mistake and sent me to the wrong address. And then the front door swung open and a woman emerged. She was slender and dressed all in black. A dress which had reached the ground, it seemed to merge with the darkness as she moved gracefully towards me. She placed a gloved hand on the gate, opened it inwards, and stepped out into the street. I snapped out of the daze that her appearance had put me in, got out of the taxi and went around to the back door to hold it open for her. My taxi was 10 years old and there were patches of rust among the paint, while I was wearing clothes that I had bought from a bargain store, but I still tried to offer a classy service, and good manners and a courteous smile costed nothing. My new passenger nodded politely at me as she got into the car, and I thought that I could see a smile on rouged lips through the black lace veil which covered her face. It flowed from the brim of a small hat which I imagined had been the height of fashion 200 years ago. With her settling into her seat, I closed the door and climbed back and behind the wheel. She was silent as I pulled away and I said nothing. If a passenger wished to have a conversation, I was happy to chat, but otherwise I kept my thoughts to myself. And as we left the outskirts, the only sound was a siren rising and falling in the distance. The closer we came to the city center though, the noisier that our surroundings became. From the frequent wail of their sirens, an emergency vehicle sped past nearby every few minutes. Music boomed from other cars. Overhead, a helicopter cut through the sky. I wound my window up and gripped the wheel a little bit tighter. My passenger's destination was in an up-and-coming area. Old warehouses lined the streets. Most were being developed into fashionable apartment blocks, and a few were complete. I could never have afforded to live there, and even if I could have, I wouldn't have wanted the current view from the completed apartments, which was of scaffolding and cranes. The street signs still needed updating as well, and I couldn't use my mobile to check because I had no signal. I thought that I was on the right road, but I was starting to have my doubts when my passenger asked, "Are you lost, driver?" There was no point in bluffing, I decided. I could tell her that I wasn't sure and would promise that she wouldn't be charged extra if the route we took was not the shortest. But I didn't get the chance to speak. Something came hurtling through the air and smashed against the windshield. I slammed the brakes on instinctively. Things had happened so quickly that I couldn't be sure, but I thought it was a bottle that had struck the car. Thankfully, the windshield didn't seem to be damaged, though I could see fragments of glass on the hood. Moments later, another object smashed against my side window. I glanced around frantically and saw hooded figures emerging from the side streets. There was no other traffic, no lights in the windows. Nothing in sight apart from more than a dozen men with their sweatshirt hoods pulled up and scarves covering their mouths. except for one man. He was swigging from a bottle, and when he had finished, he held the bottle up and aimed it at the car, threatening but not releasing his crude missile yet. While he raised the bottle, the others encircled the car. They clearly wanted to commit robbery. There was no time to call the dispatcher and ask for help. There was only one thing that I could think to do. If I put the pedal to the metal, I could drive through the figures in front of the taxi. But I would hurt them badly when I struck them, maybe even kill them. Though if I didn't try and escape, the consequences for me and my passenger, I didn't bear thinking about. It was an appalling choice, but I could still see no other way. I span around to face the lady and I began to say, "Hold on." Only she was opening her door and stepping out of the car. I yelled, "No, wait." I pushed my door open and I stumbled into the road. Where she was walking around the trunk of the car, her movements were as graceful as before. She didn't seem panicked or afraid in any way. Seeing her, the men were jeering and calling out obscene threats. Fear pulsed through my body in confusion. I didn't understand what she thought that she was doing. Even more so when she hopped with ease up onto the trunk, and then up onto the roof of the taxi. The hooded figures were laughing wildly now. They had more bottles in their hands, and these had cloth draped in them. Lighters were being produced and flames were sparking into life. They were going to hurl the flaming bottles at us in any minute, I realized, and I felt bile rise up in my throat. The lady, though, remained a beacon of calm from her position on top of the cab. She stood tall and proud, and then she lifted her veil. In the flickering light of the flames, I could see her face. She was young and beautiful. But then she changed. Ridges formed in her pale skin. Her nose widened and flattened against her face. Her eyes grew narrower and sharper at the sides. She looked now like a twisted mix of a human and a bat. And when she opened her mouth and her rouged lips curled into a dark smile, the transformation was complete. The vampire's fangs glistened as it cried out into the night. The hooded figures recoiled in horror. Bottles were dropped and broke harmlessly in the street. Flames rippled and the trails of alcohol left. And then our would-be attackers were fleeing, slipping back into the side streets. I stood there trying to catch my breath, and the vampire was a woman once again, young and beautiful and with a relaxed smile now on her face when she held out her hand to me. I gave her my hand and she climbed down easily. Through her lace glove, I could feel how soft her hand was and how cold it was. She replaced her veil and said in a calm voice, "Please continue as soon as you are able to, driver. I hate to be late for Madame de Beau's cocktail parties." "Yes, ma'am," I managed to reply, and I opened the door for her. The rest of the short drive to her destination passed without incident. I dropped her off outside one of the newly built apartments. A doorman in the uniform welcomed her inside. I radioed the office and explained that I had cleared this job, but I needed to come back to the depot early. I could see now that there were fine cracks in the windshield and that they would need to be fixed. As I set off back for the depot, I explained to the dispatcher what had happened. When I arrived, 30 minutes or so later, Joe was standing in the street outside the depot smoking a cigar on his break. He owned the company and he worked as the dispatcher. The drivers joked to his face that this was because he liked the sound of his own voice. Joe was in his 50s and always wore a white vest and crumpled tan slacks held up by braces. He looked like he had been stocky once, but his muscles had turned to flab around the time that he had gone bald, and he was constantly wiping sweat from his face with a handkerchief in the unrelenting heat. A part of me thought Joe should give up the cigars for his health, but I knew that it was never going to happen. There was more chance of him wearing a suit and tie to work or hiring a cleaner to make the inside of the depot look less like a junkyard. He greeted me with a nod, flicked ash from his cigar onto the sidewalk, and then turned and rolled up the shutter doors which led through to the depot. I rolled the taxi inside and I killed the engine. The depot was a large open space. Behind me, the shutters rattled closed, and then Joe walked past, heading for his office. This was a cramped booth over by a wall. It had clear glass sides and a door that was always open because the handle was busted. The radio and handset that Joe used to contact the driver sat center stage on a desk that was overflowing with paperwork and plastic coffee cups. He slumped into the high-backed leather chair by the desk. It creaked in protest, and Joe wiped sweat from his forehead as hairs began to sprout from his skin. Thick strands grew from his cheeks and his forehead and his chin. They curled up over his scalp and encircled his ears. Hair appeared on his shoulders and along the length of his neck, and on his hands and his arms. No doubt they were growing everywhere else beneath his clothes. In less than a minute, he was covered in a dense layer of hair. The shape of his face had changed as well, though the change itself had been lost to sight under the rapidly spreading hair. His nose and mouth had extended into his snout, and his fingers were long and tipped by curving sharp nails. Joe sighed like a man who had just loosened his belt and sat back in his chair. "That's better," he said in a gravelly voice. I was not remotely bothered by any of this. I had seen him many times before and knew that Joe was a shapeshifter. He had told me that he had learned at a very early age to hide his animal side from ordinary people, and that would always have to be the case. When he was outside taking a cigar break and could be seen by passers-by, he was Joe Stott, an out-of-shape, middle-aged man. In the privacy of the depot, though, he could relax and be Joe Stott, an out-of-shape beast. He wasn't alone in the taxi company in being strange and wanting to keep his differences private. All of the drivers had secrets. There was Jake. He was a lycanthrope. He worked 7 nights a week except when it was the full moon, and he took time off from driving and he locked himself in a cage until the dawn came. There was Sarah, and she was a siren. She had left the coastal town where she had once tempted men to their death. There was an angry mob in hot pursuit of her at the time. After this, she had chosen a quieter life in the city, driving a cab. She did sometimes sing in seedy cabaret clubs to tempt men into her embrace, though that was no longer a fatal experience for them. Now she had changed her ways. And there was me. In some ways, I was like the lady who I had driven earlier that night. I had become a vampire after being bitten by a stranger 5 years earlier. But unlike the stylish and self-assured lady, I was a struggling mess. I didn't want to be a vampire. There were many shades of monsters, each with our own dreams and fears. "Are you sure your passenger was okay?" I looked up when Joe asked me this. "Yeah, she was absolutely fine. And those punks won't talk about what they saw. And even if they did, no one in authority would listen to them." It wasn't just Joe and us drivers who wanted to keep our differences private. Our customers usually did as well. We all wanted to avoid our existence becoming known by ordinary people because of the inevitable persecution which would follow. To help ensure this, Joe's taxi company operated by word of mouth, and our only passengers were the strange. Joe grunted at my answer and scratched vigorously behind one of his hairy ears. "Better get Dan to look at your windshield then," he growled and then called out, "Hey Dan, I got a job for you." A figure emerged from a gloomy corner of the depot. He walked unsteadily, dragging his feet across the floor, and a low moan drifted from his mouth as he moved towards us. His mottled gray flesh was falling away in places and strands of tendon were exposed. There were glints of bone, the sickly sweet odor of decay. Dan never left the depot, and Joe had a discreet deal with a local butcher to supply animal brains to our resident mechanic. Becoming a zombie had given Dan a constant craving for brains and reduced him to a shambling, moaning, rotting state, but it had not taken away his ability to fix anything connected with a cab. Fixing a windshield should be a breeze. Despite this, it looked like my shift was over. By the time that Dan had made the windshield safe, it would be too close to dawn for me to go out and risk picking up any more fares. So I said goodnight and set off on the walk home. I stayed in a claustrophobic apartment in a rundown district in the city center. As I made it to my street, there were two people standing there screaming abuse at each other. Further down the road, smoke rose in gray tendrils from a burnt-out car. Welcome to the neighborhood, I thought, with a bitter smile as I let myself into my building. I closed my front door behind me, made sure that all the locks were bolted, and then went to get a sachet of plasma from the fridge. I had never fed on a living person since being made a vampire, and I never would. There was no way that I wanted to risk sharing this curse with anybody else. I sat on the battered armchair in the corner of my front room, bit the corner of the sachet off, and drank down the bland blood substitute. The following night, I was back at work as always. My windshield was as good as new and I had dropped my first fare off. There were no more customers booked in yet, so I was parked up on a quiet street waiting for Joe to call me. The heat was more oppressive than ever, but a storm was building. The sky was thick with dark and threatening clouds, and it was not long before a bolt of lightning split the gloom. A rumble of thunder followed, and the clouds broke and rain began to lash down. I was hoping that the taxi wouldn't leak when I heard it tapping on the passenger side window. There was a woman standing just outside. She was wearing a denim jacket over a dress and looked to be in her late 20s, the age that I had been when I had been bitten, and she was getting soaked in the downpour. I couldn't just ignore her, so I reached over and rolled the window down. She smiled hopefully and said, "Are you the cab that I ordered to take me to the railway station? My name is Catherine Jones." I shook my head and replied, "I'm sorry, but no." She looked upset at my answer and took a deep breath before asking, "Can you take me anyway, please?" She was shaking by now in the deluge, and I noticed that she was using a walking stick to support her weight. She was clearly vulnerable and alone. But she was not one of the strange. She was an ordinary person, and if I gave her a ride in my cab, I would be breaking the company's rules. I sighed. I was undead, but I wasn't heartless. "Yeah, sure, hop in," I said, and I hoped that I wouldn't regret my actions later. The railway station was a grand old building in the heart of the city. It was quiet when I pulled up outside a short while later. The rain had eased as well into a gentle and drifting mist. My passenger Catherine was gazing up at the impressive facade of the station, and I was glad to see that there was a smile on her face. She looked back at me and held out money for the fare. I told her, "It's on the house." I said this out of guilt, not kindness. The money from all fares was shared between the drivers and Joe, and keeping all the proceeds from this journey would have made me feel even worse. And there was no way that I could ever tell Joe about it. "That's really kind of you," Catherine said and started to get out of the cab. A steep set of stone steps led from the sidewalk up to the concourse, and as she began to ascend them, I could see that she was struggling. Telling myself that I was being stupid but not able to help myself, I found a place that I could park without getting a ticket, and I went to see if she needed a hand. Her smile when I caught up with her made me forget my worries, and I walked alongside her as she navigated the steps. The interior of the railway station was equally impressive. It was well lit and spacious. Hardwood benches sat on a marble floor under a vaulted ceiling. A large departure board dominated the wall above the entrances to the platforms. Despite the late hour, there were still a number of people waiting for trains. Most of the local services had ended for the day, but there were cross-country services scheduled to depart all through the night. Catherine sat on a bench and looked up at the board. I did not know where she had a ticket for and asked, "Do you have a long wait for your train?" A wistful expression settled on her face and there was sadness in her voice when she replied, "I was diagnosed with a serious illness last year. I'm too sick to catch a train, but I've come here tonight to look at the places that I could go if things were different. I want to dream of the life that could have been, of the experiences I could have had in places that exist to me only as names on a departure board." I was stunned and I asked in a shaky voice, "But you'll get better, right? One day you will be able to travel." She shook her head and then replied, "I'm dying, but until then I can dream." I couldn't think of anything to say apart from to tell her, "I'll wait and give you a ride home. Just let me know when you're ready to leave." She said in a quiet voice, "Thank you." I went to sit on another bench to give her some space. The only thing that I could do for Catherine was make sure that she got home okay, and that felt more important than anything else at that moment in time. I could only hope that Joe wasn't trying to call me on the radio with a new booking, but if he was, I would have to make up a reason that I hadn't answered. A short while later, Catherine rose slowly to her feet and I went back over to her. She looked exhausted and we didn't speak again as I drove her back. She turned to wave goodbye before letting herself into a small house on the quiet street where we had met. I was still parked up, my mind racing at my unexpected and confusing encounter with a young woman who had been dealt a tragic hand by the fates, when Joe's familiar voice on the radio brought me out of my daze.
"Got a job for you,"
he said. I felt a mix of guilt at my actions and relief that I had not been found out as I acknowledged the details. I picked up the passenger from a private clinic in the city center. They wore a long coat, a fedora, and sunglasses over a layer of bandages. They offered no explanation for their appearance and I asked no questions. I dropped them off at a house on the edge of the woods which bordered the city to the north and then set off back for the depot. Another short summer night would be over all too soon. I was a few minutes away from the depot when I noticed 4 taxis parked by the side of the road. I had not seen a taxi cab stand there before. Must be new, I figured. None of Joe's drivers mixed with regular taxi drivers, and the city was large enough for us to keep our distance as we went about our business. There were just 4 regular cabs waiting for a fare to come along. 4 regular drivers. A red light ahead left me waiting close by to them. One of the drivers looked at me through his rolled-down window. He was middle-aged, had short dark hair, a cigarette hanging from his lips, a forgettable face. Until it flickered. I thought that I was seeing things. I rubbed my eyes, looked again, and the forgettable face of a middle-aged man had disappeared. I was staring at a skull. A fleshless hand reached up to take the cigarette out of its lipless mouth and it exhaled smoke. I was still staring, trying to understand what I was seeing, when a horn had sounded behind me. I looked up. The light had changed and there was a short-tempered queue behind me. I rolled forwards and then pulled over as soon as I could. I peered back at the taxi with its skeletal driver. It no longer looked like an ordinary cab. Its body was pale as bone, I thought. My confusion spiraled as I saw the other taxis and the quartet now looked disturbingly different. The body of one was pitted with holes that made me think of gaping wounds. Thick liquid oozed from some of these. The body of another of the taxis was sunken in at the sides, as if somehow it was emaciated. The last of the 4 was the most unsettling of all. It was sleek and so sharp. Every exposed edge could have been a blade made for killing. From the angle that I was seeing the taxis, I couldn't make out the other 3 drivers in any detail, but I had the feeling their appearances would be just as chilling as their rides. I had never seen anything like this before. Shivering, I started the engine and headed for the familiar and safe surroundings of the depot. The minute that Joe set eyes on me, he knew that there was something wrong. He sat me down and asked me what it was. I described the 4 taxis and the skeletal driver that I had seen, and how at first there had been nothing weird about them. I could tell that Joe wanted to light a cigar, but with all the petrol and grease in the depot, that was never a good idea, so he paced up and down as he spoke. "I think I know who Skullmug was," he growled, "and who his pals were. This city's a powder keg of angry people who all blame somebody else for their problems and think that violence is the answer to it all. I've been afraid for a while now that all the hate is finally going to explode into a chaos from which there will be no return. Some people would call this the end times, a period which is heralded by a bunch of signs, including the appearance of 4 seriously scary dudes, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse." I had almost stopped shaking, but when Joe said this, I felt a fresh wave of panic. "But they were ordinary people in ordinary taxis at first," I said, searching for reasons that he was wrong. "Taxis, not horses," I added. Joe crossed his hair-covered arms over his chest and said, "You saw their true forms because vampires can observe the world differently. And as for the horse business, nobody rides them critters anymore in built-up areas, not even agents of destruction." I put my head in my hands. "What do we do?" I asked him, hearing the desperation in my own voice. He sighed. "To be honest, my friend, I don't know apart from go about our business as normal and hope that the city can pull back from the brink." That didn't help me one bit. But by then, First Light was dangerously close and I needed to get back to my apartment and shelter in the dark. As I got up to leave, Joe patted me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, don't worry about it. You're a good kid, hardworking and honest. I reckon you'll be fine come what may." Words which made me feel even worse, as I thought how I had been anything but honest with Joe by not telling him about Catherine. When I got home, I felt sick and I had no appetite for plasma. I curled up in bed and I closed my eyes. A new night saw me once more behind the wheel of the cab. There was no escape from the stifling heat and no escape from the worries which pressed down on me. The 4 ominous figures that I had seen, the way that I had betrayed Joe's trust, and Catherine. I badly wanted to see her again. While I was waiting for Joe to call me with a new job, I decided to go by the railway station and see if she was there. It was past midnight, and as I hurried up the steps and when I saw her slight figure on a bench, gazing up at the departure board, it felt for a moment as if my blood was warm again. I took a deep breath and I walked towards her. She saw me approaching and her smile eased my nerves. "I guess you found a more reliable taxi company to bring you here this time," I said with a smile. "Well, I would have called you, but you didn't leave your number." "I work for a very exclusive taxi service. We don't just pick up anybody." She laughed at this and said, "I won't be offended. Seriously though, it is good to see you again and have some company. I spend a lot of time when I'm at home on my own reading. I like horror the best and vampires are my favorites." She paused for a moment and looked me in the eye before continuing. "In the novels that I read, vampires don't cast shadows. And when you walked towards me just then, you didn't cast a shadow. Is that because you're a creature of the night?" I didn't answer her question. I could tell that there was no need from the way that she was looking at me. She knew my dark nature. And she asked without hesitation, "Will you bite me and make me like you? I won't die then of this horrible illness. I will never die." I broke free of her gaze. I couldn't look at her as I said. The transformation after I was bitten was hideous. I retched until my guts were empty. I burnt up with a fever. I was in so much pain I thought I was going to lose my mind. "In your weakened state, I do not believe that you would survive. I can't bite you, Catherine. I'm so sorry." I could feel her gaze still on me as she said, "Please." I shook my head and whispered, "I'm sorry." and then I wiped my hand across my face and asked her if she needed a ride home. She told me that there would be no need, that she had a taxi booked. I walked away feeling like I had betrayed her as well now, feeling like I was absolute dirt. When I got back to the cab, Joe was trying to call me on the radio.
Where have you been?
He growled when I answered. There was something that I had to do, I replied. There was no point coming clean now. I doubted that I would ever see Catherine again, and I definitely would never drive her in my cab. Joe didn't sound impressed with my excuse as he went on.
Well, if you're sure it's not too much trouble, there's a customer who needs picking up from a bar in the corner of Turner and Grieve Street.
I radioed back that it wasn't a problem, and I set off. The traffic around me ebbed and flowed, and I focused on the road and getting to the destination in good time, until I saw a car in my rearview mirror that made my skin crawl. Its hood was bone white and a skull looked out from behind the wheel through empty sockets. Spread out across the lanes alongside it drove the other harbingers of the apocalypse. Through their windshields, I could see the eyes of those who would bring war and famine and plague, glowing darkly in faces that had been forged long ago. And with a jolt of horror, I knew that they were looking at me. Death's cold, knowing gaze was on me as well, burning into me, judging me. I had to get away. I accelerated, almost crashing into oncoming traffic. I swerved out of the way, two of my wheels mounted the sidewalk, and I weaved across lanes, glancing frantically back to see if the 4 horsemen were still on my tail. There was no sight of them though, and I began to breathe a little easier, until it occurred to me that there was no way that I could escape them. Not really. If they wanted to destroy me, it didn't matter how fast I drove. They would eventually catch up with me. Not knowing what else to do, I tried to think about what Joe had said, about carrying on as normal and hoping that things would work out. But when I arrived at the address for the pickup, my hideous night got even worse. A van with no markings was parked outside the bar, and a figure was being bundled roughly into it by 3 men wearing dark suits, white shirts, and plain ties. They had short hair and despite the late hour wore wraparound sunglasses. I knew who they were straight away. They were federal agents, monster hunters, and they were arresting my passenger. The figure who they were manhandling started to fight back before they were forced inside to never be seen again. They broke free, but their efforts were in vain. One of the agents took out a taser and unleashed it at close range. The figure screamed out in agony and fell to their knees. Though they were not resisting anymore, another one of the agents took out a baton and inflicted a sickening blow across the back of its head. I was distraught and I wanted to intervene, but I knew that there was nothing I could do. Agents such as these hunted in packs, and there would be more vans nearby, surveillance cameras turned on the scene, and a whole host of other agents just itching to get their hands on the likes of me. I drove on. I was barely holding it together because of everything that had happened, but I made it to the depot and I parked up inside. Joe lowered the shutter and turned to me. He was still in his human form and his skin was drained of color. I could hear the unease in his voice as well when he said, "Sarah didn't arrive to pick her fare up, and I can't get her on the radio. I'm worried that something has happened to her." I told Joe about the agents. He raised his hands to his face and swore, and then hurried over to his office. He called Jake on the radio and told him to get off the streets. As he did, the sound of hammering on the shutters filled the depot, and a voice called from out on the street. "Federal agents, we know that you're in there. You have 10 seconds to exit." I turned to Joe. He looked lost and scared, and the agents didn't give us a second chance to come out voluntarily. A blade screamed as it began to cut through the shutter. A jagged line opened in the metal, and then boots were kicking at it, and dark-suited agents were streaming in through the opening that they had made. They grabbed me and Joe and hauled us outside. I couldn't see Dan, and I hoped that he would be able to slip away through the fire exit at the rear of the depot before the agents swept the place. One of them had my arm twisted up my back. Another gripped my scalp. They were both grinning. I hated them and hated myself, because I thought that this was all my fault. They had seen me and known what I was and followed me back to the depot. I didn't have the strength to struggle as they dragged me into the middle of the road. Joe was trying to put up a fight. He had changed into the beast and was clawing at the agents and trying to bite chunks out of them. He was outnumbered though, and I watched helplessly as the agents put a muzzle on him, handcuffed him, and began to kick and punch him. There were more agents out in the road and vans parked at angles. One of them stepped forward. He had a vile smile on his face, and I would have not been surprised to see him leave a trail of slime. "My name is Agent Jax. I'm in charge of this operation to clean up the city for freaks like you. And I would like us all to give a big hand to the monster who led us to your lair." A side door in one of the vans slid open and two agents led Sarah out into the road. Her face was bruised and cut. She looked at Joe and me and said in a weak voice, "I'm so sorry they made me tell him everything." From behind his muzzle, Joe growled, "Don't you worry about it, they'll pay for this." That bought him a blow from a baton and he crumpled to his knees. Agent Jax grinned and said, "This is what things like you deserve, and I won't rest until every last one of you is captured or killed." From the malicious expression on his face as he said killed, it was clear which one he preferred, and I kept as still as I could. I suspected they would kill us at the slightest excuse. Joe knew this as well, I was sure, and I could see the anger and frustration burning in his eyes. It was over for us. The agent started to lead me and Joe to separate vans, but before they could throw us inside, 4 cabs drove slowly up the road. They pulled to a halt and their drivers stepped out. I could see who they were, what they were, but for Agent Jax and his lackeys seeing the world through their human eyes, the 4 horsemen must have just looked like ordinary taxi drivers, like middle-aged men stepping out of cabs that had seen better days. "Get out of here, this is federal business," Agent Jax said. There was a sneer on his face. At first, and then he looked confused. "What the?" he muttered. I looked around at the other agents. They were shocked by what they were seeing as well. I figured the 4 horsemen had revealed their true faces to everybody gathered there. The agents were seeing what I saw. Death stepping forwards, its empty eye wells of darkness, its mouth a void from which words came. "There is evil here," Death said. Agent Jax gulped in a breath and said in what I guessed he hoped was the voice of authority, "That is right, and we are here to take the evil off the streets." Death turned its gaze towards him and said, "You are the evil here." And then it turned to the horseman whose cab was pitted with wounds. This horseman raised an arm ravaged by disease and pointed at Agent Jax. The skin on his face began to bubble and blister, and then boils began to appear. They were huge and fiery. They were all over his face, and they were in his eyes and in his mouth when he opened it to scream. But all that came out was a strangled gasp, and he fell to his knees, grasping his throat. The diseased horseman moved its hand then towards a manhole cover in the road. Moments later, the ground beneath us began to shake and the manhole cover was rattled aside. A torrent of rats appeared. They scurried towards the agents and ran over their feet and scrambled over each other to climb up the agents' legs. The agents yelped and tried to shake and push the rats off. But more rats had appeared from another opened manhole cover and the agents were being overwhelmed. They turned and ran. One of them tripped in the chaos and seconds later were covered in rats. I could make out their fangs as they bit. The agent cried out, but his pleas for help were lost beneath the squeals of the rats. They were in a feeding frenzy and the agent didn't stand a chance. I turned away from this hideous spectacle. The other agents were not trying to help, they were too busy saving their own necks. Within minutes, they had all fled and the horseman was directing the rats to return to the sewer. As the last of the longtails slipped away from view, Death said, "We are not needed in this city. Not yet." And then it returned to its taxi and started the engine. Its grotesque kin did the same and the four drove away, leaving me, Joe, and Sarah on the road. Sarah ran over to Joe and helped him to his feet. "Let's get this thing off you," she said, and led him back into the depot. I looked back at the road and the remains of the federal agent lay unmoving near the abandoned vans, his flesh torn away. A second ravaged corpse knelt nearby. The rats had devoured the boils and the pus and the flesh, and this was all that was left of Agent Jax. I felt no pity for either of them, just an overwhelming sense of sadness at the prejudice which fueled the monster hunter's actions. Trying not to think about them, I followed my friends into the depot. Dan must have hidden when the raid had started. He was there now, cutting the muzzle off of Joe with a pair of bolt cutters. Joe threw the foul thing to the ground and said, "The agents will come back and we won't have the four horsemen in our corner. We have to get out of the city." I hated the thought that we were being driven out by hate, but I knew that Joe was right. This was about survival now. Joe radioed Jake and explained what had happened and then listened to Jake's reply. He came back out of his office and told us, "Jake's going to come and get us in his taxi and we're going to drive off into the sunrise." "That won't work for me," I replied. "Even if I could fit in the boot, the daylight would filter through. I'll head back to my apartment and hide up. At nightfall, I'll follow you. Message me and let me know where you're at." With our plan agreed, I climbed back into my cab and raced through the back streets, where there were no CCTV cameras that could give me away to the feds. I ran into my apartment as the first light of the new day was banishing the dark. I forced myself to drink plasma to keep my strength up, and then sat with my back against a wall, my knees hugged to my face. I didn't think that I was going to sleep, but at some point, I fell into a dreamless pit. When I woke, I felt like the walls were closing in on me and I was gasping for breath. I scrambled to my feet. Night had returned and I could leave. But before I caught up with others outside the city limits, there was something that I had to do. I drove to the quiet street where I had met Catherine and I knocked on her door. I hoped that she hadn't set off yet on her nightly trip to the railway station and I would find her still in. The encounters with the four horsemen and the federal agents had made me think again about her plea for me to bite her and give her a dark life. I had decided that if she was willing to take the risk, then I would be on her side every step of the way during the transformation, and perhaps our new futures could intertwine. Maybe we could spend our nights side by side. My nerves were dancing as somebody approached the door from inside. It clicked open, only it wasn't Catherine. It was an older lady who resembled her. I could see that she had been crying. She smiled at me sadly and said, "Are you the taxi driver? I'm sorry, I should have canceled the booking, but there's been so much to do since Catherine passed away this morning." Sadness enveloped me. There was no point explaining that I wasn't from the taxi company that Catherine had used to take her to the railway station. She was gone and there was nothing that I could do, nothing that I could say apart from, "That's okay, sorry for your loss." I walked back to the taxi and drove out of the city for the last time. There was only one thing that I knew for sure anymore as the miles passed away. The night is the loneliest place.